Thanks, Ian. It's great to be here. I assume this working okay back there? Okay, great. So how many people saw the On Campus Today this morning? How many? So you see there was a feature article there on Lonnie Thompson today and some of the work that he's doing out in Peru. So when I was here last week and getting to learn more about the Bird Center, and Alan, you were so gracious in your time with me, just getting to learn about one of just incredible resources that this university has, and so that's why I'm very honored and humbled to be here and be a part of it. And so really gets to the intent of what are these town halls about. So these town halls, as Ian was saying, I come from the outside, so you probably have these questions about who is this guy from the outside, who is this guy from the military, is he going to go ahead and try and run us like a military organization, yada, yada, yada. So what I want to try and do is do some myth busting. I want to introduce myself to you, let you know about where I've come from, some of the things I've done, and that the way that those things really influence the way that I approach leadership and management and how I hope to really conduct my business within the office and hopefully by proxy with you. And part of this, if I forget to mention it later, when I start to go through some of my tenets of how I go through leadership and my philosophy, I've asked my core team to also hold me accountable. And so I'm going to extend that to the rest of you in terms of holding me accountable for living and conducting myself to these values. So first of all, oh, by the way, so with some of your unit leaders, I went through the back end of this presentation, but I told them they had to be here to see the embarrassing photos. And so we'll start with embarrassing photo number 1. There's embarrassing photo number 1. So I'm the youngest of 4 boys. Those are my 3 older brothers, so yes, I'm the baby right there. So as you can probably tell, so this is Matt. You can tell from Matt's grip that he did not go on to be a professional baseball player. He's pretty much capped out right there. The next oldest brother, that's Mike. Mike often reminds me that he used to change my diapers quite a bit, so he never lets me forget that. And this is my oldest brother, Mark. Mark quickly outgrew that Urkel phase that you see up there right now and actually went on to become the coolest one in the group. So as you could probably tell from what I just told you in terms of Matt, Mike, and Mark, my family had an M thing going. And so evidently they didn't realize that there were other names you could have used that started with M that aren't Morley. So you may say, well, why didn't you just go by your middle name? Well, they didn't give me one of those either. All I have is a middle initial, so no lie. So yes, off to an auspicious beginning in life. So this is where I'm from. This is my hometown, Steelton, Pennsylvania. You don't have to ask what they do there. They made steel. This here is this is a Bethlehem steel plant, and over, I guess probably 2 decades ago now, it was sold to Mittal Steel, and this is pretty much what it looks like today. Interesting perspective. So if you've ever been around steel towns in Pennsylvania or over in the eastern side of Ohio or West Virginia, they're great experiences. They're great experiences because they are such melting pots in those areas, and also in terms of, I think what it teaches you in terms of the value of people, and that's certainly an early influence that imparted on my life. Often get back there. My mom still lives right outside of Steelton, and still get back there a few times a year. So coming out of Steel High, I was looking to go to Harrisburg Community College. But then my brother was an officer in the U.S. Air Force, and he was stationed at Wright-Patterson. He was doing his master's degree at the Air Force Institute of Technology, which is there at Wright-Patterson. And he said to me, hey, why don't you come on out and come to Dayton? So I did, and I enrolled in Wright State, and that's where I did my undergraduate degree, and came out in 1987. And so I've been here really ever since, and so in many ways, I've lived here much longer than I lived in Pennsylvania, so in many ways I certainly do consider Ohio my home. While I was working at Wright State, I started as a co-op student with AFRL. So I actually started in the labs at Wright-Patterson when I was 19, and I worked there as a co-op through school. And that's where I first got exposed to the material science area. And so I worked in the labs, and then one day my supervisor came to me within the labs and said, "What are you going to do when you graduate?" I said, "I'm going to go to graduate school." And he says, "Well, why don't you let the Air Force pay for that?" So at that time period, the Air Force had a program called the Palace Night program. I got into that program, and it sent me off to school, graduate school. Before we went off to graduate school, got married. This is my wife, Kelly. We're still married. By some miracle, she's still married to me. And yes, we were older than 12 when we got married, in case you're wondering. This was in October of 1991, and then I started in graduate school the next fall. So then I took Kelly, we went off to Pittsburgh. I did my graduate work at Carnegie Mellon. This is the Mellon Institute. Spent 5 long years within that building there. Got to know it quite well. If you're familiar with Pittsburgh, by the way, that's the Software Engineering Institute that's in the back there, and did a lot of crosswork between those two different groups. I did my PhD in biochemistry there, and again, as part of the Air Force program. And then what I owed them was time back at Wright-Patterson. So because Kelly was a native of Dayton, going back to Dayton to pay back my time really seemed like a no-brainer, because her parents were still back there, and so heading back to pay back time was a great deal in our minds. In addition, I don't know, how many of you have ever been over to Wright-Patterson? Okay, so almost all of you. You know, it's a very, from a technologist standpoint, it really is like a kid in a candy store, and that's another reason that I was anxious to get back there. In terms of the confluence of the labs there between materials, sensors, and human performance, it was just a no-brainer in terms of wanting to go back there and start a research career. Sorry, I keep hitting on a slide advancer that does not slide advance, so sorry about that. So this gives you a view of then what I started doing when I got back after my graduate degree. And so at the time, I was asked to look at this interface between biotechnology and material science, and then that also bridged into sensors. And so while my home was in the materials and manufacturing directorate, I did a lot with our sensors directorate as well, and really started a life in many ways that was, say, indistinguishable from an academic's life trying to start up an early research career. Meaning I was spending my time writing proposals to funding agencies. I was out trying to secure that funding. I was trying to bring on graduate students, postdocs, staff members, and really building a research group that, again, would be almost indistinguishable from anybody on a university campus and what they were doing. Over the years, I've probably had over several hundred students actually come through the lab group over the years. And in fact, you'll see here in a minute, one of the things is I got later in my career and at the AFRL level, put a lot of emphasis behind our student programs. So at any given summer within AFRL, we had approximately 1,200 students going through the laboratory. And now they ranged anywhere from kids that were juniors in high school all the way up through the postdoctoral level. And was very, very proud of the pipeline of students that we had there. Embarrassing picture for my kids, number 2. Along the way, while I was setting up that research group, Kelly and I started our family. So these, Carson and Caleb, Carson's the older one, that's Caleb. They would absolutely kill me if they knew that I was showing you these photos right now. They would die. Because especially, as I'll show you later, this one is now 20 years old. He is a sophomore over at Rose-Hulman over in Indiana. And this one's a senior and hoping to come to school here at Ohio State next year. In the mid-2000s, I did a remote assignment. I left my assignment at AFRL and was a program manager at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. I think most people heard of DARPA in the audience. And so did programs in robotics, some of which is shown here. So If you remember back 12, 13 years ago, or even more, YouTube was really just getting started. This program here with this mechanical dog actually was one of the first videos to ever get 5 million views at YouTube during that time period. Actually wound up on the Colbert show, the Colbert Report. And we actually got letters from people that objected to us kicking a mechanical dog. I swear to God. Because that's part of what the video was showing, is that you could actually kick this thing and it could reestablish its equilibrium without falling over, which was a huge engineering accomplishment in terms of sensor feedback at that time. Also during this time period, we had the honor of working on the DARPA Grand Challenge. This was the autonomous vehicle race that ultimately we did the trials out in the California Speedway and then did the actual race through the desert. And it was a really neat experience. Again, my kids were at an age where we could take them through the pit areas of where all the different teams were doing their work. And I often tell them, I said, this will be something you could tell your grandkids someday, is that everything that you see now with things like the Google car and a lot of the self-driving car work really stems out of this challenge that we were doing around the 2004, 2005 time frame. And even today, I still use this as a way to really talking about where we need to go in just autonomy in general. And I often tell this story, this example, this vehicle right here. Obviously that's a big honking vehicle. It was known as Terramax. But Terramax, when it was going through the desert, would always slam on the brakes when it would see something like a tumbleweed. And I would say, obviously it could easily run over a tumbleweed, but its sensors had no context that that tumbleweed was something that it could easily run over. And here we are all these years later, and we're still struggling with a lot of these fundamental questions when it comes to autonomous vehicles in terms of having the context of what's a real obstacle and what's not. And so I often look back in that and think, boy, how little we've progressed. After my assignment there, I came back to Wright-Patterson and continued to further some of the research interests that you see up here that I worked on. I did a lot with biomimetics, so I just talked about autonomy. I did a lot with biomimetics. And that was the whole process of basically looking to nature, trying to understand how nature did things, and in particular with a focus on materials that are made in nature, and then figuring out either how to copy those or how to reverse engineer them. And so we did a lot of work, as the picture shows, on things like spider silk. We looked at biological modes of locomotion. We looked at different sensing that's found in biological organisms, as well as like infrared sensing. You may or may not be familiar. Pit vipers and boas have the ability to see in the infrared. We had projects that were trying to understand how does that happen. Because if you know anything about traditional infrared sensing, we do that with semiconductors. So how an organic organism does that was a lot of interest. We studied an actual beetle that has the ability to sense forest fires from over 50 kilometers away. Again, how does it sense that thermal energy? And they had very specialized organs to do that. Wanted to understand the materials involved in that. And then later on in my career, really got involved in doing work at understanding how to adapt sensors for human performance. And so this is when we were getting into not only just understanding the analytes that we wanted to sense, but also getting into this aspect of what's the best type of sensor platform that will allow you to sense that analyte. And this is where we started to really do a lot of work in things like flexible electronics and wearables as well. And really got bitten by the bug of things pertaining to human performance, and still very much a key interest item for me. So this is me as a research background, number of patents across those areas and publications and talks, fellow of both AFRL and SPIE, and a clearance. I think it may come up later, but I think in terms of one of the growth things that I'd like to see grow at the university is our ability to actually handle classified work. I think as a land-grant institution, I think that's an important aspect of what we can bring to the table. And so started some early discussions with folks about what would that look like here at the university and how would we handle that. Sort of my first leadership job within the Air Force was as the chief scientist of the Human Performance Wing. This was a new entity that was created out of 2005 BRAC. BRAC is an acronym, stands for Base Realignment and Closure. This is one of the activities that Congress sets up, and so Congress had passed that in 2005. We started to implement it throughout the late 2000s there, and it was finally completed in 2011. But this brought together the largest research center within the Department of Defense devoted to human performance issues. So within this wing, we have a School of Aerospace Medicine, had a group that was devoted to looking at human systems integration issues, and then had a group that was devoted strictly to the science and technology research of human effectiveness and human performance. And so, back to getting the bug about human performance issues, my time here being the chief scientist of this group, really I said took that to the next level in those interest areas. And I continue to feel and have it influence my thinking in terms of as technologists and in research, so many times we can get so enamored with our gadgets, not really understanding that people have to use these devices, they have to better our lives, they actually have to make a difference in the work that needs to get done. And that has been a huge influence to me. Then went down to headquarters of AFRL in 2014. Was down there for 4 years as the CTO. And again, this is where getting exposed really to the breadth of work that goes on within the laboratory. Aside from the ecosystem at AFRL that I had grown up in and knew quite well, is really becoming just as familiar with the research that was going on out at Kirtland that involved directed energy and space vehicles, work that was going on with munitions down in Florida, basic funding work that was happening in Arlington, Virginia, as well as work out of our information directorate up in Rome, New York. So a large distributed enterprise. And it's funny that across that time period, though, the issues are the same, and that's one of the things that I'm seeing in terms of the portability from things that I saw on the DoD side to over here on this side. And it's these simple things that often, I think as researchers, sometimes we can struggle with, and that's just how to tell the story of how your research matters, how it connects to people, how it makes lives better. We struggled with that in the DoD, and I could see some of that struggle over here at Ohio State already. So in some of the things that I was most proud of, I would say, during my time, initiatives on things like diversity and inclusion. I think oftentimes, especially in our organization that was military-based, we did a very poor job of making people feel included in the organization. And I noticed in one of the early questions that came in through Slido, it gets to issues like what I'm seeing here already at this institution, policies with respect to things like postdoc leave. When you don't give standard postdoc leave, that's going to disproportionately affect especially female members of the working environment, and it starts to send a signal that you're not that included. And so it's one of those issues where we took a look in the Air Force to figure out how do we change some of those policies. Mentoring, I already alluded to this earlier about the interest and attention put into trying to bring students into the lab group. And again, not just in my lab group, but across AFRL. And it was many-fold. But I'd say one of the things that really was driving that interest was wanted people to have this understanding of what happens behind the fence, what happens in your laboratory. Because as a democracy, it's very dangerous when all of a sudden the military no longer begins to look and represent the populace with which it defends. And so that's why to me, it was just very critical to make sure that if you never worked another day of your life within the defense laboratory, that was fine with me. Just wanted you to have exposure to it, know what was going on there, so that when you went off into whatever life you would have afterwards, you at least could appreciate it and understand it to some point. Started a series of talks called AFRL Inspire. This was a series of talks that were TED-like in terms of their nature and format, short snippets of what people were doing. Another commonality between researchers with the DoD and researchers here, I think telling short, concise stories of the research that you do and again why it matters. That was very foreign to the researchers we had in AFRL. They were, like all of us, we get trained to give a standard 50-minute lecture. And it's very rare that you get 50 minutes with any type of key decision maker. So being able to tell a concise story, what you're doing at a level that they understand and resonate with, and then can use that to help you further your goals was really a key thing that we wanted to get out of these Inspire talks. Community engagement. Did a lot of work with the local community within Dayton and also the local communities around our satellite sites around the country. Because as I mentioned earlier with students, it was really important to make sure elected officials knew what we were doing. The community leaders, again, felt comfortable with the work that we were doing and felt a part of it and felt engaged and had a part in the mission that we were executing. Started a seedling program to start new research areas. That's one of the things I'd really like to look at how to initialize here, is how do we begin to set up a seedling program so that we can begin to move out on new ideas. And of course, academic partnerships. So even though most of my time I worked behind a fence, I had active research engagements with many of the institutions that you see up here, including Ohio State. And I'll talk about some of those in a minute. But really, outreach to the university community was absolutely key and will continue to be absolutely key to the work that I did in the past and certainly going forward. So it was not a foreign setting. These are just some of the partnerships that we initiated with Ohio State during my time in the Air Force. In fact, that's my first meeting with President Drake was actually, he was just new on the job here. And a group of us had driven over here to sign a cooperative research and development agreement with Ohio State in the neuroscience area. And this is where we were teeing up on some of the joint medical research we could do. But a long series of interacting with each other, especially in things like sensors that are used for navigation and guidance, joint microscopy programs, our material science programs between Ohio State and the Air Force have been linked quite closely for a number of years. And then while all that was going on, the boys grew up, went off to school, as I mentioned. This was taken when Carson was a senior. And that time just flew by. And then just a little bit about our interests. My goal was to always get the boys out to see a national park every summer, and so we've done that. And Glacier was one of our favorites that took the boys to visit. We were active in Scouts. Both of my boys are Eagle Scouts. Believe it or not, I was an Ohio State fan before I came here. This picture is proof of that. This is from the Big Ten championship game, actually last year, and over in Indianapolis. And then this is the newest member of our family. That's Beckley. If you ask at the social, I can tell you that we were snookered into getting Beckley. That was a totally unplanned purchase. She's named, yes, after Beckley, West Virginia, and I can tell you the rest of the story on that. All right, so that's me. That's what I've been doing the past couple decades, and now what I'd like to do is to communicate with you and have a discussion with you about, well, how does that influence how I go about my business and how do I approach life? So first of all, I thought I'd start with the office vision and mission. Because first of all, one of the key things I learned is you don't come in and then immediately discard what has happened up to that point. I think it's bad form, for one, and I'll be the first to admit to you there are so many things that fall into that category of I don't know what I don't know. So one of the first questions that may come up are we going to get a new vision? Are we going to get a new mission? I don't know. I certainly don't have one penned out ready to go. This isn't bad, but as I begin to learn more, I'll continue to revisit this aspect of do we need to change and reflect what our vision and mission is? I think one of the biggest things that will begin to influence that will be, and I'll mention it here in a little bit, the charter that we have to go out and develop Pillar 3 of the university strategic plan. And so the very first meeting I had on my very first day was with Gail Marsh, and if you don't know Gail, she's leading up the university strategic planning efforts. And she said to me, "You're late in getting Pillar 3 done." So So Jan, Randy, and I have been noodling on how to begin moving that forward. Myself and the provost sent out a note to the colleges last week asking for their participation in their reps in that strategy development process. But that may impact what the vision and mission look like going forward. And again, this is the mission of the Office of Research. Again, not bad. It's interesting, I'd call your attention to that third bullet there about preparing a diverse student body to be leaders and engaged citizens. This aspect of addressing the citizenship issue is just one of those issues that always continues from my short time here to garner a lot of interest and support out of the colleges. So my leadership style. So again, it starts with being values-based leadership model. And these are some of the values that hold dear. So if you know anything about the Air Force, you'll recognize the first three are the core values of the Air Force in terms of integrity, service before self, and excellence in all we do. In my time there, as I mentioned, I started working there when I was 19. They've really just become a part of me and who I am. And in addition to those three core values from the Air Force, added an additional two in terms of kindness, and the importance that kindness that it plays in your role of dealing with people, and how important that can be, especially in difficult engagements, and then the aspect of always having fun. One thing that I never took for granted is the fact that as being a researcher, it was such a privilege, and that in that privilege, you should absolutely have fun in what you do as a researcher. Because especially if you're a science and technology geek like I am, the fact that you should always constantly enjoy that privilege that you have of working and developing that technology, and try not to lose sight of that. Aspects of servant leadership are incredibly important to me in trying to demonstrate that. Part of doing this whole forum is to begin to elicit transparency in how I approach life, because you got to have transparency before you can have things like trust. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but especially for those of you that'll be in meetings with me more often, I think one of the important things, especially in getting meeting dynamics right, by the way, how many people often get fed up with the way meetings are run? Read the book, Death by Meeting. It's one of the best books out there in terms of how often organizations don't use meetings right. But one of the key principles is that if you really want to have an engaged leadership group within a meeting, it's important to have psychological safety. And if you don't have psychological safety, you'll never have the type of engagement that you really want to have in a meeting. And then lastly, this aspect of focusing on people and the people that drive the mission, and never losing sight of what the mission of the organization is. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that in a minute. So, back to the mission. Again, yes, fundamentally, we are a service organization, and I think not only just within OR, but within a university setting. And I'll touch on this a little bit at the end, but it really gets to this aspect of why did I come to a university? It gets to this aspect of that service mission. And it's also, I think, important to realize that our service is to the mission first. Again, this is one of the key things, certainly, that I learned within the Air Force, but certainly within the setting, because I think sometimes there can be a tendency to service the individual over the mission. And one of the things that at least I've always tried to keep in mind is, and somehow am I losing sight of the mission of the organization by virtue of what's happening through the individual? And so I think it's always important to ask yourself, which goals am I really serving at this point in time? So some of my strengths and weaknesses, those of you that are going to get to know me, you're going to say, there are plenty more weaknesses that should be up here, so I don't deny that. And I've already stated the first one, I don't know what I don't know. And so as I go through that, I'm going to ask a lot of questions about how and why. Please don't take it personally. It's just me trying to use that process to understand. Because one of the things that's very, very important to me is to internalize the work that happens around this university. And so I begin to have a first-person perspective of that work and really have internalized it such that as I go through these different meetings and audiences, which sometimes are so hard to predict, I can be an effective ambassador for that work and be able to raise the profile of research at the university. And I'd say just lastly, I have no preconceived notions. I do have a degree of, let's say, familiarity with this setting, but I have no preconceived notions in terms of how the Office of Research should run within the university. And so I'll be doing a lot of listening, especially over these coming months. So, early observations. As I already mentioned to you, the first meeting of my first day was Gail Marsh telling me that Pillar 3 was late. And so up there on the list is really begin the process of developing that. The last thing I'll say about that process that we've embarked upon is really not losing sight. It says research and creative expression, and really making sure that everything that I can do to do due diligence to the creative expression piece. I think, again, that's one of the key things that we can bring as a strength of this institution, is really understanding what are some of the, for example, the humanities, what can they bring to this equation that really hasn't been harvested in the past. The next thing, this is sort of my second meeting on day one, was with Stacy, and finding out that I had 25 direct reports. I am no longer going to have 25 direct reports, and so that's going to change. If you know anything about supervisory ratios, if you're supervising 25 people, you're not supervising anyone. And so that's going to change. As I just referenced in my comments a minute ago, I really want to be the champion for research, and by extension, I hope everybody in OR is a champion for research. You know, want to try and start initiatives that, again, allow me to internalize what happens here through things like faculty fellow programs, through things like Research Fridays, and then communicate. And Beth has been instrumental in helping with this. How do we get the message out about the work that goes on across our different colleges? And again, the last observation I leave with you is that, again, just the people have been awesome. And they're the core of any organization. And I just tell you how impressed I have been with the people that I've met here. You know, I've been very fortunate in life in that many of the people that I dealt with in the Air Force were exceptional people. In fact, one of the reasons I wanted to come over to a university, because it has the same aspect in its DNA, and its DNA being it's at its heart a service organization. And I think the type of people that you get that are drawn to a service organization, that are there through this mission set of being altruistic in the intent, is really key. And I think that's part of what makes a research environment what it is. So that's it for slides and my comments. Matt is going to watch me totally fumble this tech exchange here and laugh, but I think if I toggle this, I can come over to Slido. Slido, and there's the hashtag Research1. And get your questions in if you haven't sent them in already. But I figure usually in an auditorium setting, people are reluctant to raise their hand. But if someone wants to raise their hand and ask a question, I'm happy to take questions now. Should have mentioned there's a social downstairs afterwards. If you'd rather talk one-on-one at the social afterwards, feel free to do that as well. Again, my intent is to get to know everybody within the office and what you do, and learn a little bit about the things that drive you and motivate you and what you like to do. So I said, feel free to come to the social afterwards, or raise a hand now and ask a question, or feel free to get it in via Slido. You can start a few weeks here. What do you see as your greatest challenges and greatest opportunities? Well, it's one and the same, and it's back to the same. This institution has the same strength and the same weakness, and that is the breadth. And so, from a weakness standpoint, this institution, and this is no newsflash to anybody in this room, the greatest weakness is getting all of the capability that this organization has to focus on an enterprise-wide problem. As you know, with the business model here in this university, everything is apportioned out by the deans and their colleges, but many of the biggest issues that we're going to be dealing with as a society and from a research standpoint do not reside within a single college. And so getting the efforts and talents across those colleges to bring to bear on a problem, that is something that this institution struggles with. And so it's one of the key things that I hope to make a difference in my time here, is trying to work across those boundaries. In the second question there, I think I'd already touched on the second piece. I don't know enough about the personnel system here at this point to answer the first part of the question, but I can tell you in the second part of the question, what I've seen out of Susan Basso's shop at a central HR is getting to this aspect of things like standardizing positions across the university. There's huge disparity in the same position across the university, and I know she wants to standardize that. And then it also filters down to also standardizing things like postdoc policies within the institution as well. So I think I talked about why the difference to come to Ohio State. And by the way, for the sake of completeness in terms of what I was looking at, Ohio State was the only solely academic institution I looked at. I had applied to a small company, a large company, an FFRDC, a federally funded research and development corporation, and Ohio State. And at the end of the day, when I did my inventory, I thought I would probably get up and enjoy coming to work more at Ohio State than I would at Lockheed Martin for the issues that I told you about in terms of do I want to work at a service-oriented organization, or do I want to work for a company that services shareholders? So it started to become a pretty easy decision at that point. What's your vision of world-class research support? I think this, by the way, this is the reason that specific wording is already in there in the time and change strategic document. How many people know the history of time and change? How we got to that point? Well, first, it's a report that was delivered by McKinsey. So first of all, I wouldn't get too wrapped up in some of the wording that's in there. Because McKinsey came in, they studied the university for, Jan, what was it, 15 months or so? And then dropped the strategic plan, time and change, to the board and to the university leadership. And so as an outsider coming in and taking a look at it, I think there's a lot of things that are kind of peculiar in it. But I think, I guess my guidance to you is I wouldn't get too wrapped up in some of the wording there. The only thing I'm focused on now is making sure that what's in Pillar 3, the part that affects us, is something that we can live with and something that we can be proud of and something that we can really make hay with as we engage with the university leadership going forward. But I think in terms of research support, I'll call out Jan here in a minute. You don't know this, I didn't tell you this, but just the other day, someone was calling out the changes, for example, that Jan had made in the IRB process and talked about how much that had saved in things like times to review an IRB protocol. So making things like IRB approval much more streamlined, that's a great example of world-class research support. So hats off to you for that. That was they said somebody singing your praises totally unsolicited the other day.
I pay them well.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. The other part, back to world-class research support is going to be back to tilting at the issue that I mentioned earlier, which is how do we effectively get research to happen at the boundaries of the colleges? And I have to find a way to entice, incentivize, and motivate PIs to want to work at that boundary space. And I think we have to, again, think about what does that environment look like and how do we create that. Why did DARPA make that big dog so incredibly creepy? But it was pretty, I'll admit it was pretty creepy. By the way, you should, if you go to YouTube and look it up, some of the comments by it are just priceless. The one who's like, millions of dollars later, the DoD finally succeeded in recreating two drunk guys creating a couch up the steps or something like that. So that was great. See, we've touched on the world-class support. I don't know, the last part of that question, envision prioritizing resources to OR support units, such as OSP and ORRP. I'd tell you my first blush at that is not to treat things like a zero-sum game. And my goal, in fact, Stacy and Mike and others can attest to this. One of my first things, my first assignment actually to Mike DeWeese was to ask him, I'd like to see the budget profile for the office going back at least over 10 years. And so Mike assembled that, and actually the budget for the office today is approximately, and check me, Jan, Randy, if others, we're approximately $3 million less as an office than where we were back in 2007. What's that?
Inflation adjustment.
And that's with zero inflation adjustment. So obviously that's in actual bottom line numbers, so actually much worse than that in adjusting for inflation. So I share that with you from the standpoint that clearly the office has not kept up with inflation, let alone grown to be able to handle all the additional, I'd say, just support elements that have been requested out of it, let alone being able to catalyze and drive new research areas. And so when you may hear about things that I'm asking some of my core leadership team to do, part of what they're doing is to actually establish what is the baseline in our funding across the different units and the people. And the reason I'm doing that is that if I'm going to effectively argue for more resources for the office, I have to know what our baseline is. And so that's the method to that madness right now. And I said my goal here is to not only just increase the budget of OR, but to increase it dramatically such that we can champion research for this organization and for this university. This university, in many ways, could be so much more of a research powerhouse than it is right now. And again, that's certainly one of my goals. What else? What are your top 3 priorities for the coming year? Well, first, let me do the first, well, it's flipping around here. The biggest difference I'm finding right now, that's an easy one, and that just happened this past week. I've been doing a series of what are called onboarding exercises where go and meet these different units. I did my onboarding with advancement. That is by far the biggest difference, because in my old world, there was no office devoted to philanthropic contributions, no office devoted to getting money out of big donors or anything like that. So that is completely, that's probably the biggest difference. And I'm glad we have them, don't get me wrong. I think they're doing great work, but just that's a huge difference. Top 3 priorities for the coming year. I would say it's really just right now, as I've shared with you, distill it down to 2. And the 2 is figuring out the baseline of business operations within the office. And then from that, using that as a springboard to advocate for new research areas. I've begun the process of sharing some of those research areas with the provost, and certainly have his early buy-in and concurrence with those. But it's just a pipe dream unless it can muster the resources to put behind it. And that's going to be my main priority. And then it just added to that is getting the office functioning with all the things I mentioned about changing the supervisory ratio, just doing things like addressing things like quality of life as well. I've come up to speed quickly about the quality of life in 1960. I hear that that's quite an issue, and want to start moving forward with that. Want to move forward with the way Bricker Hall looks. So there's just a lot of things that we want to do to begin to portray how we act and feel and look as a premier research organization. Any other questions? Graduate students or the... That's a good question about the grad student support. And I couldn't agree with that statement more. I do think, as I've started to ask around, one of the things that has surprised me are all of the different mechanisms that are available to support graduate students. And it's clear to me that not all of those mechanisms are being fully utilized. In my past position, when I would go out and visit universities, I would ask them, I would quiz them questions of how many of you are aware of what the SMART program is? Okay. So we got one. Really? Is there just one person in the audience that knows what the SMART program is? So the SMART program is the premier DoD fellowship for sending graduate students through school. They pay the grad students a pretty darn good stipend to go through grad school. Now, kind of like me, the only hitch is that what you get in return for that high stipend is you have a service commitment when you're done. But unlike me, the service commitment is just one for one. So every year of graduate school that they pay for, you owe a year of service back. My deal, by the way, was 3 to 1. I owed 3 years of service for every year of grad school. So it was a pretty hefty time commitment. But I give that as an example where what we started to do is just compile a list of, we probably on that sheet had somewhere between 12 and 18 different programs that were just devoted to graduate student support, and the vast majority of those programs people had no idea about. So, and I think, in terms of one of the objectives that I want to get across is a couple things. There's more than just NIH and NSF in this world, and that can make a huge difference for how you approach research and get support for your research. But also communicating that there are other career paths in life other than just going on and being a professor at an academic institution. And in fact, that was one of the things trying to communicate is, as we graduate folks and they go on to, say, do a postdoc somewhere, we all have seen the numbers. For every tenure track faculty open, there are several hundred applicants. So what do you think the other folks who don't get that position are off doing? And we owe them a service to start broadening their career perspective of what are those other things you can go off and do. So anything else? So again, thanks for braving the heat and humidity to come over here and the lack of parking that the medical center stole. And again, I want to encourage you, please come down to the reception afterwards. But I'm available. My door's always open. Matt knows that. It bugs the hell out of him because I'm always interrupting him. But my door is always open. My email is always open. Call. Come stop by Bricker Hall. Send me a note and tell me to come over to where you're at. I don't mind. So please reach out and let me know. Okay. Thanks, everyone.